The night air over the valley was thin and bitter, carrying the sharp smell of dust and burned metal. Far below, the remains of the compound smoldered, its walls broken and silent after the sudden violence that had torn through it minutes earlier. For the Navy SEALs moving fast across the open ground, silence was never comforting. It only meant someone somewhere was watching. 30 seconds. The team leader shouted into his mic as the thump-thump-thump of rotor blades grew louder. The Black Hawk appeared through the darkness, its navigation lights dim, its body cutting down through the cold air like a predator returning to claim its own. Wind blasted across the landing zone, kicking sand into the SEALs' faces as they dragged their wounded teammate forward. Blood soaked through the man's uniform, dark and heavy, each step a reminder that time was not on their side. Lieutenant Emma Walsh knelt beside him the moment they reached the helicopter. She moved quickly, deliberately, her gloved hands pressing gauze into the wound while the aircraft settled onto the ground. She was young, too young, some of the SEALs thought, but her voice was steady as she checked vitals, her eyes sharp despite the chaos surrounding them. "He's alive," she said firmly, "but we need altitude and speed, now." The SEALs didn't argue. They hauled the wounded man inside as bullets cracked in the distance. The ramp slammed shut. The helicopter lifted off hard, rising into the darkness as the valley shrank beneath them. For a moment, just one fragile moment, relief swept through the cabin. The SEALs secured themselves, weapons ready but shoulders easing slightly. The wounded man groaned softly as Emma adjusted an IV line, her focus absolute. This was her job. This was what she had trained for. She blocked out everything else, the noise, the fear, the shaking aircraft. Then the helicopter jolted. Not turbulence, not wind. Something mechanical. A warning light flashed in the cockpit, bright red against the darkness. "Engine temp spike," the pilot muttered into the intercom. The SEALs exchanged glances. No one spoke. Emma felt it too, the subtle change in vibration, the uneasy shudder beneath her knees. Her eyes lifted from the patient just as the helicopter lurched again, harder this time. Outside, tracer rounds sliced upward from the valley floor. "Taking fire," the door gunner shouted. The helicopter banked sharply as the pilot tried to gain altitude. The sound of gunfire grew louder, closer. A violent clang echoed through the fuselage as something struck the aircraft. Emma's heart hammered, but her hands never stopped working. She tightened a strap, checked the monitor, adjusted pressure. The wounded SEAL's pulse fluttered beneath her fingers. Then the cockpit erupted in smoke. A sharp crack rang out, followed by a shout that cut off mid-sentence. The helicopter dipped violently to the left. "What the hell was that?" someone yelled. Another alarm screamed to life, louder, angrier than the others. The aircraft shook as if something inside it had broken loose. "Pilots hit," the co-pilot shouted. The helicopter dropped several feet in an instant, throwing everyone forward. Emma slammed into the floor, barely keeping her grip on the wounded man. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she ignored it, forcing herself back into position. The SEALs cursed, gripping straps and weapons as the aircraft shuddered again. Smoke thickened, rolling from the cockpit into the cabin. The smell of burning oil filled the air. "Controls sluggish," the co-pilot said, voice strained. "Tail response is—" His words cut off. The helicopter lurched hard, nose dipping downward. Gravity pressed everyone into the floor as the sound of the rotors changed, uneven, strained, wrong. Emma looked up sharply. The intercom crackled with static. No voices. The helicopter began to descend. Vast. Outside, the dark shapes of mountains loomed closer, no longer distant silhouettes but massive, unforgiving walls of stone. Trees rushed upward from below, their tops visible even in the darkness. In the back of the cabin, a veteran SEAL braced himself and looked around, eyes wide despite years of combat. "We're losing altitude," someone shouted. Another jolt rocked the aircraft, sending loose equipment clattering across the floor. The wounded SEAL's heart rate spiked, then dipped dangerously low. Emma pressed down hard, fighting to keep him stable as fear clawed at her chest. This wasn't just bad. This was catastrophic. The helicopter rolled again, sharper this time, throwing the SEALs against the walls. The sound of gunfire faded below, not because the enemy had stopped firing, but because they were falling too fast for it to matter. The veteran SEAL's voice cut through the chaos, raw and desperate. "We're all dead." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Emma lifted her head toward the cockpit. Smoke, silence, no movement. No one was flying the helicopter. And the ground was coming fast. The helicopter dropped another 20 feet in a single, stomach-twisting second. Gravity no longer felt like a force, it felt like a threat. Emma Walsh's boots slid across the cabin floor as the aircraft tilted forward, nose heavy, rotors screaming above them with a broken, uneven rhythm. The sound clawed at her nerves. She had heard that sound before, only in simulations, only in warnings instructors gave with grim expressions. It was the sound of a helicopter that no longer trusted itself to stay in the air. The wounded SEAL convulsed beneath her hands. "Stay with me," Emma whispered, though she didn't know if he could hear her. She pressed down on the wound, feeling warmth soak through her gloves. Blood loss. Shock. Every second mattered, and the seconds were vanishing fast. Another violent jolt slammed the cabin sideways. A crate broke free and smashed into the wall, inches from a SEAL's head. He barely flinched, eyes locked on the cockpit, on the smoke pouring out like a signal flare announcing their death to the mountains below. "Pilot, talk to us," someone shouted into the intercom. Only static answered. The helicopter yawed sharply, spinning just enough to send a wave of panic through the cabin. Trees were no longer rushing upward. They were reaching out, individual branches now visible, waiting. A veteran SEAL, his face hardened by years of war, grabbed a ceiling strap and shouted, "Brace! Brace!" Emma barely had time to lock her arms around the wounded man as the aircraft dropped again, the floor seeming to fall away beneath them. Her stomach lurched. Her ears rang. The pressure inside the cabin felt wrong, like the air itself was tearing apart. Then another impact. Metal screamed from the tail section. The helicopter spun harder this time. "Tail gone," someone yelled. Emma's heart slammed against her ribs. Tail wrote her failure. She didn't need flight school to know what that meant. The helicopter was no longer unstable, it was uncontrollable. The spinning accelerated, faster and faster, the cabin blurring into streaks of light and shadow. SEALs slammed into their restraints, teeth clenched, muscles locked as the world twisted violently around them. The wounded SEAL's monitor flatlined for half a second. "No, no, no," Emma muttered, slapping the side of the device as if anger alone could force it back to life. A faint pulse returned, weak but present. The helicopter pitched downward again, now in a full, terrifying descent. Outside, the valley rushed up to meet them. A SEAL near the ramp laughed once, sharp, broken, almost hysterical. "This is it," he said. "This is how it ends." Emma looked up. She didn't see fear on their faces anymore. She saw acceptance. That scared her more than anything. Another warning alarm shrieked, louder than the rest, drilling straight into her skull. The cockpit was a wall of smoke now, black and thick, swallowing what little light existed. Through the haze, she thought she saw movement, then realized it was only the aircraft's own instruments flickering and dying. The helicopter bucked violently, throwing Emma forward. She slammed into the bulkhead, stars exploding behind her eyes. Pain ripped through her shoulder, but she bit it back, forcing herself upright again. She glanced at the altimeter through the cockpit door. Too low. Far too low. A seal's voice cut through the noise, raw and furious. "Someone do something." No one answered. No one could. Emma's gaze locked on the cockpit again, the open door, the empty seats, the lifeless shape slumped forward unmoving. The truth hit her all at once, heavy and undeniable. There was no pilot. There was no co-pilot. There was only gravity. Her training screamed at her to stay with her patient, to keep him alive for as long as possible. But another voice, quieter, colder, cut through the chaos. If the helicopter crashed, the patient would die anyway. So would everyone else. Her hands trembled as she stood. The cabin lurched again, forcing her to grab a strap to stay upright. Every instinct told her this was madness. She wasn't trained for this. She wasn't cleared for this. She wasn't supposed to be here. She took one step toward the cockpit. The helicopter dropped again, close enough now that she could see individual rocks lining the valley floor. A SEAL noticed her movement. "Where are you going?" he shouted. She didn't answer. She took another step, then another, fighting the spin, fighting the pull of the floor as the aircraft twisted beneath her feet. Smoke burned her eyes, made every breath a struggle. She reached the cockpit doorway just as the helicopter rolled sharply to the right. She slammed into the frame, pain tearing through her ribs. For a second, she nearly fell back, but strong hands grabbed her vest and shoved her forward. "Go," the SEAL yelled, "go." Emma crawled into the cockpit. The sight inside froze her blood. The pilot was slumped forward, helmet cracked, blood streaking the controls. The co-pilot hung motionless in his harness, head tilted at an unnatural angle. Screens blinked erratically. Gauges spun wildly. Warning lights flashed like a battlefield of red. The controls shook violently beneath her hands before she even touched them. She swallowed hard. The helicopter spun again, faster now, centrifugal force dragging at her body. Her mind raced, too fast, too loud, training manuals, emergency briefings, half-forgotten lessons. She reached for the controls. Her fingers closed around the cyclic. The helicopter dropped. The ground surged upward. Emma Walsh took a breath, one deep, desperate breath, and did the only thing left. She tried to fly. Emma's hands shook as she gripped the cyclic. Every fiber of her body screamed, "You're not a pilot." Yet there was no time to think. The helicopter spun violently, and the valley below expanded and contracted like a living nightmare. She could hear the SEALs in the back, clinging to straps, their faces pale under the dim lights, eyes locked on her with a mixture of fear and disbelief. She tried to remember the training, just fragments, but her mind raced faster than her hands. Pull gently, smooth, don't overcorrect. She twisted the cyclic, but the helicopter pitched sharply to the left, throwing her against the instrument panel. Sparks flew from a broken gauge. The rotor shrieked, the sound raw and metallic, filling the cockpit with a noise that vibrated through her bones. The aircraft tilted dangerously. Trees, rocks, and the edge of the mountains loomed closer. One wrong move and they would all die. Emma's first instinct was to panic, but she forced herself to breathe, inhaling through her nose, exhaling through her mouth. Her patient's pulse throbbed against her hands. She couldn't fail, not now, not ever. "Control," a SEAL yelled from the back. "We're going to crash, you're not a pilot." His words cut like a knife, but she didn't respond. There was nothing to respond to. If she didn't act, they were all dead. She remembered the emergency drills, cyclic, collective, pedals, the pedals. She slammed her foot down instinctively on one, twisting the nose slightly. The helicopter jerked, nearly flipping sideways. Heart in her throat, she yanked back on the cyclic, fighting gravity, fighting the momentum. She felt the aircraft stabilize for a heartbeat, just long enough to realize how fragile it really was. Smoke filled the cockpit, stinging her eyes, making it difficult to see the altimeter. Red warning lights flashed, alarming her further. One engine had failed completely, fuel leaking into the already stressed system. The aircraft's tail had been hit by gunfire. She could feel the irregular vibrations through the cyclic. Each moment in the air now felt like a lifetime. From the back, the SEALs were shouting, giving her instructions she barely understood. Left, pull left. Increase collective. Brace. She tried to incorporate their words, but it felt like learning a new language mid-flight, mid-fall. Every decision was life or death. Every second counted. Emma's mind raced, searching for solutions, something, anything. Her hands moved instinctively now, pulling, twisting, adjusting. For a brief moment, she felt the helicopter respond. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't spin uncontrollably. She had slowed the fall just enough to avoid the jagged rocks below. The SEALs caught their breath collectively, the tension in their shoulders easing slightly, but only slightly. Then came the sharp lurch. The helicopter banked dangerously to the right. Emma screamed internally, gripping the controls so tightly her knuckles turned white. She fought the momentum, muscles straining as the rotors wailed above. Dust and smoke swirled past the windows. The night sky was now streaked with jagged shapes, mountains, trees, rocks. They were falling into a trap, and she was the only one who could navigate them out. She remembered something her flight instructor once said during a simulation. Control is patience, not power. Move too fast and the air will kill you. She tried to slow her movements, steady her hands, and coax the helicopter back into level flight. The collective vibrated under her grip. Sweat burned her eyes, mixing with the smoke and dust. She couldn't think of herself. Only the aircraft. Only the people behind her. A round of gunfire struck the tail again, rattling the cabin violently. The co-pilot remained slumped, unmoving. She tried to adjust, but the helicopter groaned under the damage. Sparks flew from the instrument panel. She could feel the tail rotor losing stability. This is it. If this goes, we go. She pressed her lips together, refusing to scream, refusing to cry. The SEALs in the back were now silent, watching her every move. Their earlier panic had turned to something else, shock, respect, a dawning realization that the young nurse might just save them all. Emma focused. Every second of flight knowledge she had, even the scraps she applied. Nose up, slowly, steadily, adjust the collective, right pedal, keep it level. She could hear the rotors whine, see the faint flicker of danger on every gauge, but she refused to look down. Minutes felt like hours as the helicopter stabilized, if only slightly. The valley below was still close, but the aircraft wasn't plummeting anymore. Emma's chest heaved as she realized she had bought them another few precious moments. The SEALs' breathing shifted. Some muttered thanks, others simply stared, all written across their sweat-streaked faces. Then came the realization they weren't safe. Not yet. The helicopter had taken severe damage. Only one engine was operational. The tail was compromised. Fuel was critically low, and the mountains and enemy fire were still waiting below. Emma knew that even if they survived the immediate fall, they would have to make a landing, and that would be the ultimate test of her courage, skill, and improvisation. The Black Hawk shuddered again. Dust rose from the ground as they hovered precariously over a narrow canyon. Emma's hands shook, but her mind cleared. She was no longer a rookie. She was the only pilot they had left. The SEALs had given up hope. She had not. "Stay with me," she whispered to the wounded SEAL, even as her eyes darted to the altimeter and then to the canyon below. Every movement mattered. Every second was critical. They were still alive, barely, but survival depended on her next move. And in that moment, Emma Walsh realized that she would either become a hero or go down with the aircraft, and there was no other option. The helicopter shuddered violently, every bolt groaning under stress. Emma's hands were raw and trembling as she fought the controls, trying to coax the Black Hawk back into some semblance of stability. Outside, tracer rounds sliced the night, ricocheting off the fuselage. Each hit sent sparks into the cabin, smoke curling upward, making her eyes water and her throat tight. She barely had a moment to breathe. One wrong adjustment, one hesitation, and the aircraft would spin into the canyon below, taking everyone with it. "Keep her steady," one of the SEALs yelled from the back. His voice was sharp, almost panicked, though he clung tightly to his harness. "Don't let her spin, don't." Emma ignored the voice and focused. She recalled the basic flight drills, fragments of emergency procedures, gentle cyclic movements, smooth collective adjustments, careful use of the pedals. The helicopter was damaged, one engine completely gone, the tail compromised, but she had learned enough to try. She couldn't overcorrect. She had to coax, not fight. The aircraft pitched to the right suddenly, almost throwing her off her feet. Emma slammed a foot onto the rudder pedal, twisting the nose back into alignment. Sparks flew from the control panel. A thin line of smoke now poured into the cockpit, stinging her eyes. Her hands shook, her arms ached, but she forced herself to move methodically, deliberately. The Black Hawk responded ever so slightly. Not perfectly, not even safely, but it was enough to slow the spin. The SEALs in the back watched in stunned silence. Their earlier fear had morphed into something else, tense hope, disbelief, and begrudging respect. One of them leaned forward and muttered, barely audible, she's doing it. Emma pressed forward, eyes darting between the instruments and the canyon below. The terrain was unforgiving. Jagged rocks, scattered boulders, and narrow ridges threatened to end everything. The wind screamed around the aircraft, tugging at the fuselage, spinning it with chaotic force. Smoke and dust swirled in the cabin. The wounded SEAL groaned beneath her hands. His pulse was weak, fatting. She adjusted the IV, pressed hard on the wound, trying to stabilize him while simultaneously controlling a dying aircraft. A sudden jolt threw the helicopter sharply to the left. Emma's stomach lurched. She bit back a scream. Her hands flew over the cyclic, then the collective, then the pedals, adjusting desperately. The Black Hawk wobbled violently, tilting dangerously. A flash of movement outside caught her eye, a tree impossibly close. She yanked back on the cyclic. The rotor whined in protest. Sparks flew from the panel. Smoke filled the cockpit more thickly than before. She blinked through it and tried to focus, forcing her breathing into long, steady pulls. One movement at a time, one adjustment at a time. The helicopter shuddered, groaned, and for a heartbeat it felt stable. Not safe, not secure, but stable enough to keep them alive. A SEAL shouted again. "She's still alive, keep her alive." He slumped back into his harness, gripping his weapon tightly. Another gunshot tore through the night outside, hitting the tail. The aircraft shook violently. Emma pressed her lips together, concentrating on every twitch of the cyclic, every vibration from the tail, every whisper of the controls beneath her fingers. Time slowed. The Black Hawk teetered, as if balancing on a knife's edge. Emma realized they were descending too quickly. Altitude alarms screamed, barely audible over the rotors and gunfire. One more bad gust of wind could send them spinning into the canyon wall. She scanned the valley below. A dry riverbed cut through the rocky terrain, narrow but visible. It could be a landing zone, but only barely. Too small for an emergency touchdown, too risky to attempt. The thought of it made her heart hammer, but she knew she had to consider it. There was no other choice if the helicopter stayed airborne any longer. Another jolt sent Emma forward, her chest slamming against the cyclic. Pain flared in her shoulder. Blood from a scrape ran down her arm. She ignored it. There was no time for injury. She had to think, act, survive. She adjusted the cyclic again, slowly, smoothly. The helicopter responded, pitch and roll leveling out fractionally. The tail shuddered, loose and unstable, but it held. One engine was gone, the other was straining to keep the aircraft aloft. The noise was deafening. Sparks continued to fly from the panel. Dust and smoke filled the cabin. The wounded SEAL's monitor beeped irregularly, a weak lifeline. Emma whispered, "Just hold on, just hold on." For the first time, the SEAL saw it. This rookie nurse, untrained, inexperienced, underestimated, was keeping them alive. Every adjustment was deliberate, every decision precise, born of instinct and adrenaline. She was no longer panicked. She was focused. She was commanding the aircraft. But the valley was closing in. They were still too low. Trees scraped the fuselage. Rocks flashed beneath the landing skids. The wind clawed at the helicopter. Every second was a battle, every breath a test of nerve. Emma realized this was only the beginning. Stabilizing the helicopter in freefall was one thing. Landing it, alive, with everyone intact, would be the ultimate test of courage, skill, and sheer nerve. Sweat streamed down her face, stinging her eyes. Smoke burned her throat, her muscles ached, yet she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The helicopter groaned in protest, the tail wobbling dangerously, engines screaming. And yet she controlled it, just enough. Slowly, carefully, methodically. They were still alive. A seal finally exhaled in disbelief. Another whispered, she's keeping us alive. Emma didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed forward. The canyon, the rocks, the narrow riverbed below, everything mattered. She had survived this long. She would survive longer, because failure was no longer an option. Not for her, not for them, not ever. The Black Hawk shuddered again, dangerously low, yet under her control. Emma Walsh had taken the controls of a dying aircraft and forced it into a fragile, impossible balance. But the real challenge had only just begun. Survival required more than skill, it required courage. And Emma had none to spare. Emma Walsh's eyes darted over the valley floor below, heart hammering in her chest. The Black Hawk groaned under her hands, one engine dead, the tail barely holding. The altimeter screamed warnings, flashing red and bright. They couldn't make it to base. The mountains were closing in like a trap, unforgiving and absolute. She scanned desperately, looking for even a sliver of hope. And then she saw it. A narrow, dry riverbed cutting through the rocky canyon. Jagged rocks lined its edges. Dust and boulders littered the path. There was barely enough space for the landing skids to touch down. The choice was obvious and impossible. She swallowed hard, forcing her hands to stop shaking. The seals in the back were tense, silent now, watching her. No one dared speak. The wounded teammate's pulse fluttered weakly under her fingers. Every second was a countdown to disaster. "This is our only chance," Emma muttered under her breath. Her voice sounded calm, but inside fear clawed at her chest. "Brace yourselves." The SEALs reacted instantly, some yelling in disbelief. "No, that's suicide," a veteran snapped. "You can't land there." "I have to," Emma replied, her voice firmer than she felt. "There's no other option." The helicopter pitched and swayed dangerously as she adjusted the collective and cyclic, trying to line up the riverbed. Rocks whipped past, trees clawed at the fuselage, and sparks flew from the cracked panels. Smoke filled the cockpit, stinging her eyes. Her gloves were soaked with sweat and blood. Every fiber of her body screamed that she couldn't do this. She remembered everything her instructors had said during training: how to anticipate turbulence, how to balance a failing tail rotor, how to maintain altitude with a single engine. Most of it was theoretical, abstract. Now, theory collided with raw reality. Lives hung in the balance, and one wrong move meant instant death. The Black Hawk lurched again, throwing Emma against the instrument panel. She gritted her teeth, fighting pain and fear. The tail was unstable, the engine groaning, and the rotors spun at their absolute limit. Outside, the canyon walls closed in like a vice. She knew that if she misjudged even a foot, the skids would hit rocks, the tail would snap, and they would all be shredded against the riverbed. The wounded SEAL groaned beneath her, and Emma pressed on his wound with one hand while adjusting the cyclic with the other. Every movement was precise. Every fraction of a second mattered. She could hear the SEALs holding their breath behind her. She couldn't fail them. She wouldn't. She angled the helicopter toward the riverbed, skimming perilously close to overhanging rocks. Dust rose from the canyon floor as the skids grazed stone, sending sparks flying. Trees scratched against the fuselage. The Black Hawk trembled violently. Emma fought the controls with every ounce of strength she had, trying to keep the descent slow enough to survive, fast enough to stay airborne. A SEAL yelled from the back, voice sharp with panic. "You can't land there. We're going to die." Emma didn't answer. Words would accomplish nothing. Only actions mattered. She adjusted the pedals, twisting the nose slightly. The aircraft lurched again, then stabilized for a heartbeat. The riverbed stretched beneath them like a narrow strip of salvation. Rocks and debris threatened at every turn. The tail shook violently, groaning under the stress. She pressed her lips together, eyes burning with smoke and determination. She could feel the aircraft losing altitude faster than she wanted. The altimeter flashed critical. She tugged back on the cyclic, raising the nose slightly, but the Black Hawk's damaged tail made it wobble dangerously. Sparks flew from the instrument panel as if the aircraft itself were screaming at her. Emma's heart hammered as she counted down in her head. 100 feet, 80, 60, 30. She could hear the rotors straining, feel the vibration in her arms and legs, see the canyon edges rushing closer. She pressed the collective, pulling hard. The Black Hawk rose slightly, only to drop again, skimming over jagged boulders. She could hear the SEALs bracing behind her, harnesses straining, weapons clattering to the floor. The wounded SEAL groaned, and she pressed harder on his chest, willing his pulse to stay. The riverbed was almost under them now, narrow, jagged, impossible. She angled the helicopter carefully, twisting the pedals, leveling the skids, easing the tail. The fuselage scraped against a rock, metal screeching, sparks flying. Emma grit her teeth, muscles burning, sweat pouring down her face. The Black Hawk dipped dangerously, then stabilized for a moment, just enough to breathe. Outside, the enemy fire continued. Tracer rounds struck nearby, kicking up dust and debris. Emma had no choice but to ignore it. Focus, she told herself. The aircraft, the canyon, the landing, everything. Finally, the skids touched the rocky riverbed. Emma eased the collective, absorbing the impact. The helicopter skidded across the uneven stones, rattling violently, tail lurching. Trees scraped the fuselage, rocks chipped the armor, but she held the cyclic firm, adjusting continuously. Sparks flew, dust filled the cabin, but they kept moving, alive though barely. Seconds felt like hours as the Black Hawk skidded to a stop at the end of the riverbed. Silence fell, broken only by the groans of the injured and the hissing of the engines. Emma exhaled slowly, shaking, blood and sweat mixing on her hands and face. She had done the impossible. The SEALs looked at her, eyes wide, disbelief and respect mingling. One of them finally spoke, voice low and hoarse. You saved us." Emma didn't answer. She slumped back in her seat, chest heaving. Outside, the canyon was silent except for the distant echo of enemy movements. The impossible had been done, but this was only the beginning. Survival was temporary. Extraction and escape would come next, and Emma knew the real fight was far from over. For now, though, they were alive. Against all odds, the rookie nurse had taken control and brought them safely to the ground. The Black Hawk lay broken across the narrow riverbed, its rotors twisted and shattered, metal screaming under the strain of impact. Dust and smoke hung thick in the air, swirling around the jagged rocks, obscuring the canyon walls. Emma Walsh's hands shook as she released the cyclic, her knuckles white, her chest heaving. For the first time since takeoff, silence seemed heavier than the gunfire or alarms, a silence filled with disbelief. The wounded SEAL groaned beneath her. Emma immediately checked his vitals, fingers trembling as she felt a weak pulse. "You're alive," she whispered, even though the words sounded almost surreal. Against all odds, they had survived the impossible. She felt a sharp pain in her shoulder from the crash but ignored it. There was no time to attend to herself. Around her, the SEALs assessed their own injuries, bruises, cuts, and shattered equipment. One slammed a fist against his helmet in frustration, adrenaline still thrumming through his veins. Another checked his weapon and muttered a curse under his breath. But the first thing all of them did was look toward Emma, eyes wide. Shock, gratitude, respect. None of them had expected the young nurse to take the controls, and now none could deny it. Outside, the canyon was alive again. Enemy forces had realized what had happened. Gunfire echoed from the edges of the cliffs and ridges above, tracer rounds sparking against rocks and sand. They were closing in, moving carefully through the shadows, unaware that the SEALs had survived the crash. Time was short, and the helicopter offered little cover. Emma quickly assessed the situation. "We need to move," she shouted to the SEALs. Her voice, calm yet commanding, cut through the panic. She shifted to help the wounded SEAL, pressing a hand to his injury and adjusting the bandage as quickly as she could. "I need you up. We can't stay here." The SEALs followed her lead, forming a perimeter around the wrecked aircraft. The canyon's walls limited visibility, but Emma knew instinctively that holding this position even briefly could buy them enough time for a secondary extraction. She moved methodically, checking each soldier's condition while simultaneously scanning the rocky terrain for signs of approaching enemies. Smoke from the helicopter clung to her clothes and hair. Her gloves were streaked with blood from the wounded SEAL and from her own minor injuries. Every movement caused a new jolt of pain, yet she pressed on, treating wounds, applying pressure, securing equipment. In the back of her mind, she knew this moment would define them all. The difference between surviving and dying was now razor-thin. The SEALs secured the perimeter, weapons trained toward likely enemy approaches. Emma positioned the wounded SEAL between two team members, stabilizing him as best she could. "We need to keep moving," she repeated, more firmly this time. "Stay sharp. They'll come for us." A sudden movement caught Emma's eye, a shadow flitting between rocks at the canyon's edge. Bullets zipped past, kicking up dust dangerously close. The SEALs returned fire immediately, each shot precise, practiced, deadly. Despite the chaos, Emma's hands never left the wounded SEAL. She was the constant, the anchor, the heartbeat keeping him alive while the world spun violently around them. Minutes stretched like hours. Enemy forces approached cautiously, but the team's disciplined perimeter fire kept them at bay. Emma noticed a small incline leading out of the canyon, a path that could lead to safety if they moved carefully. She signaled to the SEALs, pointing toward the escape route. They nodded, following her lead, though each step was heavy with exhaustion and pain. Emma moved first, ensuring the path was clear. Her mind calculated distances, angles, and cover as she went. The wounded SEAL moaned softly, but she whispered reassurances as she pressed a hand to his chest, keeping his pulse steady. One of the SEALs glanced back at the wreckage, then at Emma, and muttered under his breath, "I can't believe it. She saved us, all of us." The team advanced slowly, bullets kicking up stones and sand as the enemy continued to probe. Emma's attention never wavered from her patient. Every movement, every step, required coordination, speed, and precision. The helicopter, once a vessel of terror, now lay behind them, a reminder of how fragile life could be. After several tense minutes, they reached the incline. From there, the canyon walls opened slightly, offering a better vantage point. Emma took a moment to catch her breath, keeping one hand on the wounded SEAL. She glanced back at the wrecked Black Hawk. The fire had not yet reached the fuselage, but it was only a matter of time. They had escaped immediate danger, but the extraction was not yet complete. The SEALs regrouped at the top of the incline, covering the rear as Emma helped the wounded SEAL move. Her arms burned with exertion, and her shoulder throbbed from the crash impact. Yet for the first time she felt something else, a strange, quiet pride. She had taken the controls of a dying aircraft and brought them to the ground alive. Against impossible odds, she had done what no one else could. From above, the sound of distant jets pierced the night. Reinforcements, rescue, hope. The enemy seemed to hesitate, unsure of how to advance. Emma took a deep breath, keeping the wounded SEAL stabilized as the team prepared to move toward the approaching air support. They weren't safe yet, but for the first time in hours, survival felt possible. The SEALs looked at her again, and this time there was no disbelief, only respect, only gratitude. She had become more than a nurse that night. She had become their reason to fight, their anchor in chaos, the difference between life and death. The Black Hawk lay in ruins behind them, a monument to what had almost ended them all. But Emma Walsh had emerged, unbroken, unyielding, and in control. The extraction wasn't over yet, but she had given them a chance. And in the Valley of Death, that was everything. The canyon was alive with the sound of gunfire, rocks chipping under bullets and tracer rounds slicing through the night. The SEALs formed a tight perimeter around the wreckage and the wounded, their weapons trained on every likely approach. Dust and smoke choked the air, making visibility difficult. Emma Walsh pressed herself against the wounded SEAL, checking his bandages, applying pressure to slow blood loss, all while bullets pinged dangerously close to her. She had no cover, no choice, and no hesitation. Survival demanded every ounce of focus. One of the SEALs leaned over, whispering sharply, "We're exposed. We can't hold this forever." Emma met his gaze briefly, her eyes unblinking. "We hold long enough," she said firmly. "Help him stay alive. I'll keep an eye on the perimeter." Her calm authority cut through the panic. For the first time that night, the SEALs realized this rookie nurse had not just kept them alive in the air, she was keeping them alive on the ground. Shots echoed off the canyon walls. Rocks dislodged from nearby cliffs. The enemy was methodical, circling in, trying to find a weak point. Emma continued working on the wounded SEAL. His pulse was weak, erratic, but still there. She whispered encouragement, giving instructions to the SEALs. "Keep your heads down, cover left, cover right. We move only if we have to." Her voice was steady, almost mechanical, but the urgency behind it was palpable. Time stretched. Each second was an eternity. Bullets hit nearby boulders, kicking up clouds of dust and debris. Emma's hands moved instinctively, cleaning wounds, changing bandages, monitoring vitals. Sweat mixed with blood and dirt, stinging her eyes, but she ignored it. Pain and fatigue were luxuries they could not afford. The helicopter behind them smoldered, an unstable shield, drawing enemy fire and offering limited cover. The SEALs moved like shadows, keeping their positions, firing in short bursts, controlling the angles. They had fought together for years, but tonight they were relying on Emma's calm precision. A sense of unity formed, silent but tangible. They were no longer just surviving. They were fighting to ensure they all made it out alive. Then from the canyon entrance, the first faint hum of jets reached them. Emma's heart lifted slightly. Air support. Reinforcements. A chance. The enemy hesitated, uncertain, the sound of the approaching jets cutting through the tense night. Every SEAL's weapon remained trained outward, eyes scanning the shadows. Emma didn't stop her work. The wounded SEAL's pulse was fatting, and she pressed harder, whispering, hold on, just a little longer." The enemy attempted a flanking maneuver. Bullets tore into the canyon walls, sending stones flying. One SEAL shouted, returning fire, suppressing their approach. Emma felt the vibrations through the ground as the shots hit near her. She gritted her teeth, refusing to let fear dictate her movements. The wounded SEAL's breathing was shallow. She pressed her hands firmly on his chest, feeling every weak pulse, every flicker of life. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The SEALs rotated fire, ensuring no flank was unguarded. Emma maintained constant attention on the patient. Sweat poured down her face, her hands cramped from pressure and tension, but she didn't move, didn't waver. She was the pivot holding them all together. The hum of helicopters grew louder. Searchlights began cutting through the darkness, sweeping the canyon. The enemy seemed disoriented by the sudden sound and movement. Bullets slowed. Shouts of confusion rang out. Emma glanced toward the canyon opening. The relief aircraft had arrived. Extraction was within reach, but only if they held a few more moments. Emma took a deep breath, her voice rising over the noise. "Prepare to move. Wounded first. We go now." The SEALs obeyed instantly, forming a protective shield as she helped the patient toward the waiting helicopter. Each step was calculated, deliberate. Dust and smoke stung her eyes, but she forced herself forward. The enemy fired sporadically, but the suppressive fire from the SEALs kept them at bay. The team moved carefully, Emma guiding the wounded SEAL, the perimeter closing behind them. Sparks from the destroyed Black Hawk still flew, but the air support provided cover, strafing the canyon edges and drawing enemy attention upward. Emma felt a flicker of hope. They were not safe yet, but for the first time that night, survival seemed possible. As they approached the extraction point, Emma glanced back at the riverbed, at the twisted remains of the Black Hawk. It had been their salvation and their prison, their terror and their chance. She had guided them down in an impossible situation. She had faced death and refused to blink. The SEALs reached the waiting helicopter. The wounded were lifted first, then the others. Emma herself was helped aboard, collapsing into the seat, exhausted, bleeding, covered in soot and sweat. She caught her breath, glancing around. Every SEAL was accounted for, alive. The rotor blades lifted them off the canyon floor, the hum of the helicopter carrying them upward. Below, the enemy forces were in disarray, regrouping but too late. Emma exhaled, a long, shaky breath. For now, they were safe. Extraction was complete. The SEALs looked at her again, faces grim, exhausted but grateful. Respect and awe shone through every line, every glance. The rookie nurse had not just survived. She had led them through the impossible, keeping the wounded alive, the perimeter secure, and the team intact until rescue arrived. Emma slumped in her seat, feeling the adrenaline drain, her body shaking. She had kept them alive, but the night was far from over in her mind. They were safe, yes, but the memories, the fear, the weight of responsibility, it would stay with her. She had taken control when no one else could, and in doing so, she had saved lives. Lives that would never forget her courage. And above all, she realized something she had not known before. Sometimes heroism is not about training or experience or even skill. Sometimes it is about refusing to give up when everything says you should. Emma Walsh had refused, and now, as the helicopter carried them toward safety, she allowed herself a brief, shaky smile. They had survived. Against impossible odds, they were alive, and she had made sure of it. The helicopter cut through the night sky, engines straining as they carried the battered team toward the base. Below, the valley where the Black Hawk had crashed disappeared into darkness, leaving behind only smoke, jagged rocks, and memories of terror. Inside the cabin, the SEALs sat slumped in their seats, weapons still at the ready, adrenaline slowly fatting. Emma Walsh leaned back, her body aching, her uniform stained with blood, soot, and sweat. She had done the impossible, and now, at last, there was a chance to breathe. The wounded SEAL moaned softly, stabilizing under Emma's careful observation. She kept one hand on his chest, monitoring his vitals, ensuring that every breath he took was steady. The rest of the team had survived, but the ordeal was etched into every line of their faces. Exhaustion, disbelief, and gratitude mixing in a silent acknowledgement of what had just happened. For Emma, there was no room for self-congratulation. The Black Hawk was destroyed. The mission had nearly ended in disaster, and yet every person on board had survived because of her choices, her courage, and her quick thinking under pressure. She pressed her hands against her aching shoulder, taking stock of the injuries she had ignored to save others. Pain had become a distant companion compared to the weight of responsibility she had carried all night. Outside, the sky slowly brightened with the first hints of dawn. Searchlights from the base illuminated the clouds of dust rising from the valley below. Emma glanced out the window and caught a glimpse of the destroyed Black Hawk. The fuselage was twisted, the rotors shattered, the tail broken at a sharp angle. It looked like a monument to failure. But to her, it was proof of survival, proof of defiance against impossible odds. As the helicopter touched down at the base, medics rushed to meet them. The wounded were immediately tended to, and Emma remained beside her patient, ensuring that his pulse remained steady. The SEALs helped her step out, offering words of thanks, clapping her shoulder, a rare and silent acknowledgement of heroism that transcended words. For a rookie nurse untrained in the ways of battle, this recognition was profound. She had earned it not through skill alone, but through courage and unwavering focus. Inside the base, debriefings began, and the story quickly took on a life of its own. Veterans recounted the events, emphasizing the moment the helicopter lost its pilots and the aircraft seemed doomed. Every report highlighted Emma's role. The young nurse who had taken the controls, stabilized a dying aircraft, and guided the team to a narrow, impossible landing. Officers nodded in disbelief as they reviewed the footage and logs. She had defied expectation, rewriting the rules of what a medic, or anyone, could accomplish in combat. Among the SEALs, no one spoke directly at first, yet their glances, nods, and subtle gestures conveyed more than words ever could. One of the veterans, older and grizzled, finally said, voice low but firm, "I don't care what the reports say. That nurse saved our lives. She's one of us now." The team remained silent, but a quiet consensus passed between them. Emma Walsh would never be underestimated again. Days later, the official commendations arrived. Emma received medals she had never imagined, her name etched into records alongside seasoned operators. Yet she returned to her duties with the same quiet determination, refusing to let fame or accolades define her. She continued treating patients, both on base and in training exercises, but the story of that night remained alive, among the SEALs in the briefings, whispered with reverence and awe. The memory of that night lingered with every member of the team. The Black Hawk's descent into the valley, the impossible landing, the tension of the canyon, the fear and the courage, it became legend. Veterans recounted it during quiet moments, new recruits listened with rapt attention, and commanders referenced it as a reminder that heroism could come from anyone, at any moment, under any circumstance. For Emma, the lasting impact was personal. She had learned the weight of responsibility, the limits of fear, and the power of decisiveness. She had faced death in the air and chaos on the ground, and in both moments she had chosen action over hesitation. And though the adrenaline faded and wounds healed, the lessons endured. She had discovered that heroism was not about rank, experience, or even training. It was about the courage to act when all else seemed lost. Years later, the SEALs would still retell the story, each retelling emphasizing her role. They spoke of the moment when they had thought death was inevitable, and how one rookie nurse had seized control and refused to surrender. Not because she was fearless, but because she had no other choice. In every recounting, Emma Walsh became more than a nurse. She became a symbol, a living testament to the fact that courage can emerge from the most unexpected places. And so the story endured. Among the SEALs in the halls of the Navy and in the whispered tales of those who served, the night the Black Hawk nearly fell, and the rookie nurse took the controls, was remembered. It was a story of terror and hope, of chaos and calm, of lives hanging by a thread and one person refusing to let go. Emma Walsh returned to her work quietly, avoiding the spotlight, but those who had been there never forgot. They spoke her name with respect, awe, and gratitude. She had saved lives, yes, but more than that, she had inspired belief in what humans could do when the odds were stacked impossibly against them. In the end, it wasn't the helicopter, the bullets, or the canyon that defined that night. It was courage, decisiveness, and the refusal to give up. And Emma Walsh had all of it in full. The legend lived on.